All right, folks, you all win the gold stars for sticking with us for the full day and for being first back in your seats. I'm sure there'll be some stragglers joining us in a minute. But I'm excited for our panel now on globalizing technology and finance. Of course, we're not going to solve climate change unless we can solve it at a global scale. And that means deploying trillions of dollars of capital all over the world in a variety of different investment environments. Tremendous diversity in the kinds of contexts that we need to think about mobilizing capital and building infrastructure and technology at scale. And so I'm excited for our panel today. Well, first we have Bella Tonkanogy, who's the U.S. Director for the Climate Policy Initiative, a think tank that thinks deeply about these challenges. And mobilizing finance is her specialty. Sri Sekhar is the Climate Finance Lead at Deloitte. And Sean Kelleher, Senior Group Director of Finance at Worley, who sees at the front on the front lines a number of these projects as they enter into the construction phase as well. So we're excited to break down on this panel the types of investments that need to be made across different technologies, different types of infrastructure, the diversity of challenges that we face in different parts of the world, whether that's the United States or Europe on one hand, or China on the other, or emerging countries in Africa, very different contexts. And to think about the fact that we are transitioning from an energy system that digs stuff up out of the ground and burns it, if we make it very simple, to one that involves a substantial amount of upfront investment in a built infrastructure that then serves us for a long period of time and can deliver low-cost energy, but needs a substantial amount of upfront investment. And that really compresses the timelines to get the investment moving and the financing secured to get these projects built. So one of the potential key bottlenecks that we've spent a lot of time here at the Andlinger Center as part of our Rapid Switch initiative, really trying to think through how do we unlock capital to move at that pace. So Bella's going to kick us off with some of the facts and figures that we need to ground ourselves in this conversation. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse. Thanks for the invitation to this really fascinating day. So as Jesse mentioned, I work at Climate Policy Initiative. We're an analytical and advisory nonprofit organization focused on helping businesses, financial institutions, and governments address climate change while driving economic growth. A lot of our work is focused on the area of climate finance. What climate finance is basically investment that is for climate action. And we do a lot of work in both the mitigation space, so reducing emissions, as well as in the adaptation space, which is how do you make investments to reduce the physical impacts of climate change. And then within climate finance, we work in 3 areas. The one that I'll talk about right now is on tracking investment trends. So we have a big data science team that looks to understand what are the sources of investment, where is it flowing, what are the sectors it's going to, what are the kinds of instruments, financial instruments like equity and loans that are being used. We do a lot of work in what we call effective finance, which is around how do you mobilize more investment, and a lot of that work is about public finance and in emerging markets, especially around development finance institutions. And then the last is around transformative solutions. So we run an incubator for climate finance products, among other things. So just to give you a bit of data, as I mentioned, we track climate investment trends. So every year we release something called the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which aggregates data around how much climate investment is flowing. And we've been doing this since 2011. So now we have a decent data set. And what we've seen over those last 10 years is that investment is growing year on year. The last years of data that we have are for 2019 and 2020, and they show that actually sort of a flattening or plateauing of that growth in those years, which is quite worrying. We are going to be releasing some new data at the end of this month, so do look out for that. But the overall story is growth, but in fact kind of tepid, whereas we really need to be growing exponentially. So this is just a more detailed view of that $632 billion. This is a Sankey chart, or a spaghetti diagram, if you will. On the left side, what you see are the sources of finance. So blue is from the public sector, orange is from the private sector. So globally, about 50% of climate investment is coming from the public sector. These are national development banks, they are multilateral institutions like the World Bank, they are state-owned financial institutions, and then the other half is coming from the private sector, in particular commercial banks, corporations, and households. And just to say, what we measure is primary investment, so investment into actual projects or into actual things that reduce emissions at that level. So we're not measuring secondary market activity like stock trades or bond purchases. The second column is the instruments, so between grants and debt and balance sheet financing and equity. The uses, most finance that's going for climate action is going to mitigation. That's that third column, so about $571 billion, and then adaptation is a very small sliver of total investment globally. And this is, of course, getting more and more dire as climate impacts are getting worse and worse. We need to, at the same time that we are driving more and more investment into the energy transition, we need to remember that climate impacts are already happening, and we need to be supporting, in particular, the most vulnerable communities to adapt to climate impacts that are already happening. And then finally, on sectors, probably no surprise, most investment is going into the most commercially viable sectors, so that would be transport and energy systems, and I'll just give a little bit more information on that. So renewable energy is the largest mitigation sector. Commercialized technology, solar PV and onshore wind are the vast majority of that. But what we saw in the last report, which we issued last year, was that low carbon transport is the fastest growing sector, and that's really a result of the strong growth in the EV market. You see things like rail and public transport are actually quite low in comparison. Just very relevant to the conversation that we're having today is that most climate finance, and this is similar to most finance, is concentrated in the developed economies. So those are those three bars at the bottom. So US and Canada, Western Europe, and then East Asia and Pacific, and that's really China. I didn't put the animation in, but what you see, the four central bars, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, that's where you have the highest growth in populations, the highest growth in urbanization. We need to see far more climate investment going into those regions if we are to address climate change. So that's a lot of the work that we do. I know it's a lot of the work that Sri and others do, is figuring out how then do you actually deploy that finance and reduce the risks and reduce the barriers for investment flowing into those regions so that you can address climate change. Finally, last slide. Even though we've seen incremental increases over time, the blue rectangle at the bottom left corner here is a small version of the first slide that I showed, showing overall climate investment over the last 10 years. And then the solid line starting at 2021 is estimates of where we need to be in terms of annual investment levels. So we are at a place where incremental improvements year on year are no longer sufficient, that we need to be making step changes in investment, and that is of course related to all the things that we've been talking about today and more in terms of how do you actually prepare the right projects, put in place the right policy reforms, get the data and disclosure out there so that you can bridge that gap. And that's a lot of the work that we do. I won't go into this, but just to summarize, there were the four things that we are seeing in the finance sector in terms of levers of action. So making credible net zero commitments, you see that a lot in the private sector. Scaling up climate investment and using new products and new financial structures to be able to do that, or new ways of using public finance, which of course is a big part of what Jigar Shah was talking about and doing, accompanied by the policy reforms that are required, and in particular underlining a lot of issues around and needs around just transition. And then finally, the data systems and disclosures required to really assess how we're doing and iterate over time. So with that, I will pass on to Sean. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So a little bit about Worley. Worley's an energy solutions provider globally. We design, build, and construct all sorts of facilities. And at the moment, the fastest part of our business that's growing in both the Americas and around the world is in the sustainability domain, so they're predominantly driven by energy transition. We like to take a fairly practical approach to solving challenges. We do projects, moving the money around, but getting the money spent requires, a number of different gates. You have to get projects sanctioned. Someone has to get through their financial governance to commit to move the money before you can move into construction. And often that holds up any of the early spending on procurement. So with that in mind, I was looking at some of the information that was prepared in the Ambition to Reality work a year or so ago with Princeton. And here we see the current renewable energy and associated transmission infrastructure in the US in 2020. Look now at the same infrastructure required for net zero by 2050. Vast areas of new wind and solar infrastructure, the transmission corridors to get the energy distributed, and virtually all scenarios have the same rollouts. It may not look so daunting, but let's focus on an example. The city of St. Louis in the great state of Missouri, to see what this looks like locally. This is an area in terms of solar and wind infrastructure as it currently stands. And this is an example of the new assets that will be needed by 2050. So if I just stop here, to get your bearings, the red coloured areas are 500 megawatt solar power stations, the blue areas are 80 megawatt wind farms, the purple lines are new transmission lines, and the black are feeder circuits from the new solar and wind facilities. And what strikes me about how to do this is the amount of social engagement and community engagement to establish all of this infrastructure in and around communities, which has to happen before you can get the capital deployed. You won't get through your gates. That's one challenge. Now, let's look at another example, a different one to the US. Here is the core electrical infrastructure in Australia as of 2020. If we look through to 2050, and this is only one scenario, you see much more infrastructure required. It's a very different story to the US, but here we have large nation and scale enabling infrastructure, vast industrial renewable hubs up in the north, which in land coverage are roughly equivalent to the scale of the United Kingdom. So once again, challenges here very different. If you think about the whole enabling the funding to get through to the point where you can install these projects, there's an enormous amount of community engagement, the supply chain enablement, there's going to have to be pre-investment. And I'd argue that in many of these situations, you can't really do this on a discrete project by project basis to meet the timeframes. You have to run a program. It's a big country. Australia needs to replicate the entire world renewable energy fleet, something which has taken 100 years to build in Australia by 2050. And that's only those technologies mentioned. So the easy part, of course, is identifying what has to be done. The trickier part is how. As we deploy capital at the moment, the processes have to change. Capital deployment cannot be disassociated with the risk, and the assessment of risk either needs to be revisited or that risk needs to be mitigated through, for examples, the underwriting of offtake supply pricing, taking responsibility for community engagement on a program level, the sharing of intellectual property amongst collaborative partners are just a few of the things that'll enable that type of engagement to free up the capital. But they're just a few of the things. So thank you. I'll pass over to Sri.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Well, hi everyone. Good afternoon, and I'm obviously really interested in getting into the panel discussion very quickly, but I'll start with a few comments here. First, a big thank you to Chris and Jesse and Diana, who I've come to know over the last couple of weeks. It's a great event, and yeah, looking forward to this great discussion that we're about to have. So, when Chris kind of asked through my bosses, and I work for a consulting firm, so I have very many bosses, for me to come speak about climate finance, I kind of wanted to think through, what is the perhaps unique perspective that I can bring to the conversation. And I think, what that unique perspective is that I do a lot of work, as, Bella just mentioned, in emerging markets and the developing world, right? Where the context can be quite dramatically different. And just to give you a little bit more context, I work for Deloitte. Deloitte is a big global firm that does many things, including, tax, audit, and accounting. But what I do is management consulting, and my clients are organizations like USAID, the World Bank, and the US Department of State. And I thought to myself, what are the current trends in climate financing that are impacting these particular organizations or my clients? And they're the following, right? They're new sectors, new tools, and new realities. And what I'd like to talk about is probably what the next 5 to 10 years of development finance in this space is going to look like, right? So a lot of what we heard here today is an increasing interest for those countries that are leaders in erstwhile leaders in the climate transition and the new raw inputs that they need, particularly critical minerals. But then there's also kind of what Bella spoke about before. It's the underinvestment in climate adaptation and where we need to be. On new tools, I think another thing that Bella pointed to, not to completely steal your presentation here, but the new mechanisms that are required to kind of get the climate funds out, right? So the big development finance institutions have no problems making the commitments. It's really getting them to productive use. So that's going to take new instruments and new tools. And then lastly, new realities. And this is mostly just an observation of the renewable energy industry and how that's changing overall and what's needed to change in terms of investment and business models. So kind of getting down into it, I have never really talked about sports along with my climate discussions. Those two things don't quite overlap very much, but they did this past year. I don't know if anyone knows the tennis player Novak Djokovic, but he was recently told that he couldn't play in 2021 in the Australian Open. And upon the return of to Serbia, he took a very vocal sort of stance in support of these large protests of this once-in-a-lifetime mine in Serbia, and what could be an economic game changer. It was a $2 billion potential lithium project in the country. And due to politics and environmentalism and a lot of other things, the protests had reached a fever pitch, and the president decided to revoke the licenses of Rio Tinto after 2 decades of development and $500 million, right, of investment. So the reason I bring this up is because over time, what these development organizations are going to be doing is be in the business of opening new markets. So if you look at where the Department of State is right now, that's in the bottom left of your screen. There's a footprint in DRC, Zambia, Brazil, Greenland, where stuff like this could happen. And then separately on the right side, I'm sure that I don't need to tell very many people here about the devastating toll of Hurricane Ian. Somewhere in the ballpark of $67 billion of damage done in Florida. And, climate change probably increased, we're hearing now, the rainfall by about 10%. So I don't want to drown everyone in data here, but I want to quickly just talk about what the issue is and what's driving some of these development finance institutions to do what they're doing, make the shifts that they are. And I think we heard from Anthony before, it's important to take a full supply chain view. Chinese companies, Chinese firms, state-owned, entities have certain choke points along somewhere in the value chain of different either components or minerals that are, vital to the energy transition. So if you see here, 90% of lithium phosphate battery production, 90% of lithium hydroxide production, 85% of refined rare earths go through China. And that's why a diversification of supply is needed. And when you talk to financiers that are in IFC or the Department of Energy, we heard from Jigger earlier today, what they might see when they look at the sector is that it perhaps compares favorably to sectors that development finance institutions typically invest in, right? So you see an IRR of 30% in a brand new mine that's being pitched to the Department of Energy right now, asking for $500 million, and promoting a 3-year payback period. But that's after 10 years of development. That's 10 years of no revenue that needs to be taken into account. And then add on top of that, and I realize that I'm sort of quickly running up on time here, that even post-production, and this is another thing that Anthony mentioned, despite a 10x price surge in lithium prices that we've seen in the past year and a half, things can go, they are particularly susceptible commodities, that is, to the ups and downs of the economic cycle. And lastly, I'll just mention, post-Hurricane Maria analysis, we saw that investment in things like undergrounding distribution cables could return, 4 or 8x the investment. So just very quickly here, I mentioned the issue with getting climate financing out is the disbursement. This is an analysis on the left side between 2013 and 2017. Whereas, 86% of non-climate related development finance got dispersed, 60% roughly of climate finance gets dispersed over a 4-year period. It's because they can't find the projects, right? So a lot of things are being explored right now, inclusive of carbon markets. And, part of the COP26 meeting was to approve Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which could boost carbon markets. And then I think you'll hear a lot in the development finance world that early stage projects need more equity investment, and there's a need for demand aggregation, particularly because what we're going to see, and I'll just focus on the right side and quickly wrap up here, is that grid integration is going to become an issue as more and more corporates are, demanding direct purchasing of power, right? So the type of aggregation that you need is to pull through equipment that can sort of help emerging market grids reform over time and integrate more renewables and plan for things like reverse power flows. So I'll stop there and hand it back over to you, Jesse.
Yep.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so I think all of you touched on the need for new tools, new mechanisms to finance things. For those of us who are not living and breathing finance every day, can one of you walk through what's the current tool set? Like what's the typical process? Say, I want to develop a 500 megawatt solar farm somewhere in an emerging market, South Asia, Africa. What's the typical process now, and where does that get snagged up? And maybe, I know, Sean, you want to start? And then
Yeah.
to jump in on this.
Yeah, so typically, depending on the developer, they would be trying to, for that type of thing, their first avenues to try and secure an offtake agreement for the supply of the power.
What is an offtake agreement for folks?
Just an agreement with a set price on what the price of the power would be to the...
Somebody's going to buy it over a long period of time, right? Yeah.
That's right. And with that, they would use that then to secure financing. But in the meantime, they have to go and, obviously work through their supply chain, price up all their different components, labour, other contractors, and pass their regulatory requirements. Subject to that, they would then pursue either project financing or through whatever avenue, whether it's a institution, partly government, or some other organisation.
Mm-hmm. And where does that typically get snagged up?
Usually, well, the regulatory and environmental piece can be the first part, the cost evaluation, and then the time frame it takes to get from securing that offtake agreement to then having everything there where you can get finance. Price escalation will happen,
currency
things
risk
will become uneconomical, be more difficult. There could be geopolitical issues moving into the country. And any of those things are pitfalls that could stall the project.
So Sri, what does that typically do to the cost of capital for a project in say, an emerging market versus a similar project in a developed economy?
I mean, it explodes it, and timelines too, right? I mean, if you're going to do a wind project in Texas, which GE does a lot of, that used to be my former employer, or in Canada, we're talking about, even if it's a 50, 100 megawatt wind project, maybe 2 years to commercial operation, it's 5 to 6 in a place like Zambia or Botswana or something like that. And that really eats into what your return expectation is. I might, Jesse, go a step maybe before where Sean got to, where I think kind of a critical issue has persisted in development finance, at least, which is the formation of the special purpose vehicle, right? The actual development of the project entity, which requires equity investment. There's kind of an old heuristic in terms of, what you need for the early stage investment versus what you need in terms of construction capital.
Yep.
And that equity is like 1% of the total cost, right? What you need really is a sound team. This is nothing more than just getting together a good project team, understanding that you have the right people that understand the local environment, the local regulations, et cetera. And then you need to have someone that takes that early risk capital for something like a 30% return, right? And often what that means is kind of sitting there with the team and discussing what the next steps are until you get to financial close, where you get the big money, right? The big sort of 8%, increasingly 10, 11%, construction loan, right? So I think that, to me, is the part of the puzzle, working with organizations like the World Bank that are supposed to have the risk appetite to do things like that. You don't see as much. And there's reasons for that, and they're worth discussing, but that to me is an important first step.
Yeah, and that's a high risk stage, right? That's why you need that 30% return, because a lot of those projects don't ever make it to that final investment decision, right? So you have to cover your bets and there. So what are some of the innovative ideas that, different approaches to financing projects that are coming forward? Bella, you sort of have a think tank, you have the incubator model going at CPI. What are some of the solutions that have come out of that seem to be gaining traction?
Yeah, I think there are, we've seen a lot of really interesting solutions. I think one of the more successful initiatives we've worked with is a fund called Climate Investor One. They are now $1 billion fund focused on renewable energy projects in sub-investment grade countries. So those are countries where their bonds are either very poorly rated or sometimes unrated. What it does, what this team did, their private equity company, they formed to put together this fund. What they did was they took all of the different phases of the infrastructure investments. So you have the development phase, which is what we've been talking about. You have the construction phase, and then you're operational. And at each stage, you have to find the investors. You incur different percentage of costs. You have to put the teams together. You have to, basically there's just like transaction costs at every stage. And there are different types of investors coming in at every stage. And so what they did is they put everything under a single fund structure. They dealt with some of the conflicts of interest of passing projects from one phase to the next. But what they did was then said, okay, they brought in donor capital into the development stage so that you could address some of these early stage risks, because 1, 2, maybe 3 out of 10 projects will actually make it to financial close. So everything that they get, the projects that they put in their development fund, which is highly concessionary, which means the capital is not expected to be returned at market rates. Then they develop the projects, and then their construction fund can take them right over and then ultimately get refinanced. So I think that's been a fund that has really helped address a lot of different risks simultaneously.
So Sean, do you want to add any other models that you've seen?
Recent models are where there's been a strong commitment to a particular technology, whether it be, or solution, if I say, whether it be solar, wind, or direct air capture, or carbon capture and storage, something like that, where they're taking more of a program approach. You know, project one by itself would be uneconomical, but understanding that, you know, the vision is that there's 12 of them, and, you know, to do that, they'll work closely, really collaboratively with critical vendors. They'll get them on board, work together, other contractors such as ourselves, and really you work in more of a loose alliance, all committed to the program, understanding that, you know, there's strong capital governance required, but if project one has to work so that you get a good understanding of the rundown and reduction cost of the total installed cost of the other projects, you'll get economical quickly and not get into the stage where you end up beating each other with the contract on project one. But that takes a lot of trust.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you build those relationships?
Long-term commitment, and the relationships they can start at the project development level, but they've got to be up and down the chain from executive all the way. CEO to CEO type of commitment's what you need.
Yeah, Jesse, I might add to some of the things that, you know, both Sean and Bella have said, by pointing out kind of the, you know, traditional suite of risk reduction kind of products that the World Bank and others have, even, you know, sort of the USDFC and others in Germany, elsewhere. It starts with more boring things, and we can progress to exotic, but like the standard loan guarantee, right? Or the partial risk guarantee, which is absorbing the risk of first loss. So there is a price that you can pay for the project entity that covers the risk of the inability to make your first loan payment or some part of that loan payment. So that's an additional level of coverage. And then slightly more exotic can be things like risk insurance, which covers everything from, you know, let's say Novak Djokovic and, you know, the president of Serbia say that this project shouldn't go forward anymore and will revoke these licenses. There's some level of political risk insurance that can be provided by organizations like USDFC and Euler Hermes in Germany. And then, you know, a little bit further along the line, I would say is, you know, along the lines of what Bella was talking about, there are, you know, essentially VC organizations within these development finance entities, like IFC Infraventures being one of them, right? Where you get in at the ground level and you have some level of project ownership or equity, and you try to help them along through the early stage, or what's known as the Valley of Death. And then increasingly, I think where we're headed to, for a number of different reasons, because to go to what Sean, I think, began this discussion with, which is the offtake agreement, right? The standard power purchase agreement, which has kind of helped the renewables segment, even domestically and internationally, explode, is based on a couple of core criteria, which is it's a public sector utility. I mean, in the old days, public sector utility, and it's a 20-year long, you know, long-term contract. It's fixed price. You're kind of removing the risk out of the, you know, out of the situation for the lender. Where the market is going is, particularly in Europe and the United States, is that corporates are beginning to be the off-taker, right? I talked a little bit about this, or maybe I didn't get a chance to get into this. PPA rates, corporate PPAs in general, the tenors of them, are not commercial after 3 years. So you're getting up to 3 years and you can no longer trade that contract anymore. And we're seeing kind of, you know, all over countries being interested in this model because they see it as a double whammy of foreign direct investment. Both the consumer and the developer get to invest in your country, right? So increasingly, investors are being asked to be at risk in a mature renewable energy environment. And maybe what can kind of, you know, help this along are things like carbon credits, right? That helps. It's another stream of revenue for the project, and it's potentially, and we'll see what it looks like in the next 2-3 years, something that a company can actually value and has an incentive to buy. But that's what I would say among the risk-reducing type of instruments that are out there.
Okay. So Bella, I was really struck by some of the charts that you presented, and two really were eye-popping. One is the real paltry level of investment in climate adaptation at the same time that we are seeing every month, you know, damaging climate disasters, climate-fueled disasters all over the world, and trillions of dollars of infrastructure that we need to be thinking about there. And then the step change between the kind of sub-trillion dollar a year level of financing that we have now and the sort of $3 trillion we probably need to be at. Are there any big things that you see that could get us sort of through that step change, that that we could wake up and start doing things, and get onto a S-curve, type that sort of rockets up to that level, as opposed to sort of the cumulative plodding, growth?
Yeah, I think, well, so on adaptation, adaptation's it's challenging for a lot of reasons. One is that it's still unclear what all of the private investment models are, because adaptation it's not necessarily revenue generating.
No, it's building loss avoiding.
Exactly, loss avoiding, risk avoiding. Insurance is one of the most important ways that all of us adapt to climate change. You buy insurance so that in case but the insurance is actually harder and harder to get, and we're starting to see that in Florida in particular, where people are talking about the wipeout of wealth of many, many, many people.
Or wildfire-prone areas in California or the West. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about adaptation investment, there are some revenue-generating opportunities, in particular in infrastructure, or in people talking about nature-based solutions, which is actually investing in nature. So, say coastal erosion reduction, or building wetlands projects. Exactly. But then a lot of it, when you talk about finance, is about mainstreaming, and it's really about how do you mainstream the assessment and reduction or mitigation of risk within your portfolio. So how can we work with every bank, every financial institution to assess those risks and to learn how to assess those risks, and then to incorporate that. So there's a lot in there also. With respect to like regulatory approaches for disclosure, et cetera. So that's adaptation. It's really challenging. It's a very nascent area as well, and very, very, very important. On that incremental step, on that step change, I mean, there is, I think, and you kind of see it in just the discussion today, where it's all about, the energy transition, right? And this is, I think there is a really important opportunity over the next 10 to 15, 20 years of everybody getting behind all the things that we've been talking about today and really accelerating the deployment of solutions. On the flip side, we also need to be retiring, for example, coal plants early. That's going to be a big part of emissions reduction, so we're working on financing mechanisms to do that as well. Write-downs. There's a big project in South Africa right now working on that. Likely an announcement coming with donors in Indonesia at COP27, which will be in Egypt next month. So I think there's no silver bullet. We got to work on everything that we've been talking about today and beyond.
I mean, in some ways, it seems like the challenge is to get from we shouldn't have to be talking about climate finance anymore. It should just be finance, right? And infrastructure and energy and everything else is embedded in all the investments we're making. So that's where, there are trillions of dollars of infrastructure investments that are going to be made. Will they be climate resilient? If so, then they're adapted. If not, then we're putting money at risk and assets at risk and people at risk.
Exactly.
And so how do you mainstream that so that all the investment is climate finance, right? And that's sort of when we've won, right? That's
right.
The end goal that we're moving towards. So, on the energy side, I mean, give a sense of sort of the total scale of capital investment, if anybody can do that, relative to what we're seeing going into clean energy or low carbon energy, and how close are we to that tipping point where it's just all clean energy investment? Have a sense of that?
I could say that right now I think we've reached installed capacity in renewable energy to be 17% of global installed capacity, maybe a little bit higher than that. So a lot, I mean, is what I would say, right? So that's nowhere near where we need to be. And a lot of that is still, some 8% of that is still being curtailed. It's not all being put into, generation. So the scale is vast, I would say, and that's why, part of the focus that we were having, and I don't know if this is, a discussion purely about new installed capacity, new sort of generation assets, or if it's grid upgrades, right? So those grid upgrades, I think, are going to become, and it's more than just infrastructure or hardware and stuff like that. It's the software and the training people up to use that, right? System integration. I think all of those things need to happen, and it needs to happen if like 50% of the equation is developing countries. How do you explain to Sri Lanka that's historically using, right, diesel fuel to power its, which is an awful thing for beyond climate reasons to be powering your grid with? How do you,
especially with current global oil prices,
exactly,
right? That cause a huge crisis there.
Exactly. Like, how do you, inform grid operators, here's a different way in which to operate your grid? And by the way, they're super educated. They're extremely smart. They know what they're doing. They just have to totally revamp their business model.
So just on that needs number, I think the estimates are that we need about $4 to $5 trillion a year in investment, and I think current levels of all energy investment are far lower than that. So we are talking about a very capital investment heavy transition.
So there really is.
So we need to, because clean technologies are CapEx heavy, OpEx light. So you don't pay for the sun and the wind after you already built the plant, but with coal plants, natural gas plants, most of the costs are coming in operating expenditures. So it's a big change in actually how you finance and how you think about the life cycle cost of new technologies.
Yeah, so there's really two challenges there. One is we need to get all of the investment to be clean, right? Otherwise we're continuing to dig a deeper hole. But also the scale of investment has to grow because we're shifting to more capital intensive assets. And I think that's an underappreciated piece of the challenge. One of the potential solutions that Sean, you kind of got at this a little bit about sort of programmatic or regional scale efforts. I mean, we have to build at such a massive scale that going project by project and sort of individual private developer coming forward and saying, I want to build this one or that one, doesn't feel like it's going to move at the pace that we need or accomplish the public purposes that also are part of these projects, right? Yes, a private sector entity needs to make enough money to pay back their loans, and it needs to be a viable, profitable, venture. But also, if we're going to sustain the clean energy transition, if we're going to deliver environmental justice goals, if we're going to, create employment, there's a whole set of public purposes that go along with this as well. How do you think we can try to tackle these things at a regional, programmatic scale? At not thinking about gigawatts, but tens of gigawatts. Not thinking about single projects, but dozens of projects. Are there ways that we can move forward at that scale, and what role does sort of the private sector and the public sector need to play to do that?
Yeah, I would say there's got to be a lot of collaboration, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's private or public that has to lead it. It kind of feels like because of that programmatic and the regional approach you would need to do to install that much infrastructure, that it has to be public-led.
Yeah, interesting too.
And then it comes down to the whole capital governance and the risk assessment around it. If it's all financial outcomes only that the programs or projects measured on, that's going to make it really difficult for the private sector.
Yeah.
So moving to more full ESG outcomes, incorporating some financial outcomes, so whether that be carbon tax relief, penalties, something around there will help the overall allocation, I would see, shift towards that when you apply the risk assessment of it.
It also could lower project development risk, right? Because you have a kind of regional public-driven effort to identify what we want to get built, not what we want to say no to, right? I mean, like the current process is propose a project, go through all of the different veto points, and if any one of those says no, you're done. And your money goes poof, right? Whereas if you've sort of pre-permitted and pre-planned at a regional scale, that this is what the public wants and this is the sort of community input that we've already got, that really does de-risk development potentially as well, which could lower cost of capital.
And it would give you the ability to pre-invest in these supply chain items that you need. And
you're going to not do one project, but a dozen.
That's right.
I would say there's, and I was talking to Jesse about this before the panel, is that there are some learnings we can take from from what's been going on in emerging markets over the last years into the U.S. So For example, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, they had a program called Scaling Solar. And what they did was they worked with a country, with a national government, to exactly what you say, to pre-permit solar projects. So they would choose the site, they would get everything in place, they would get the power purchase agreement in place, and then they would go out and they'd bid out multiple sites for
Private development.
VCs to come in and develop them. Now, could we do that in the US? I think that could be a really nice model to think about here.
Yeah, if I could respond to that, Bill, I happen to be just wrapping up a project, let's call it, it was called Mega Solar, right? And I think it's still going, and USAID it's an initiative to basically put 5 gigawatts-ish of solar in the ground between the countries of Namibia and Botswana. Got funding by the, I forget the name of the program again, it was Scaling Solar, right? So got funding through Scaling Solar, and we progressed along those lines. And I think Scaling Solar did really well in other parts of Africa, but where it kind of broke down among these countries, not saying that, there isn't a lot of reason for optimism, is sort of, they have to be walked along in sort of why focus on this technology as opposed to, for instance, green hydrogen? Why is our policy focus here as opposed to everything that we're hearing in other sort of interesting technologies? So the policy focus, I think, needs to be there. And if there's drift, you kind of like lose this theme. And all the World Bank can do is sort of say, we'll do the integration study, or we'll provide the, some level of upfront capital, but you've got to bring the projects here, you've got to have the procurement. And if you haven't done a renewable energy procurement as a government before, it's not gonna look great. And you're not going to get the types of investors that you want. So that becomes difficult. But I think, here in Texas, we had a really good, almost that sort of scaling solar model for wind energy, their renewable energy zones.
Yeah,
that they
transmission
create,
expansion.
Right? Exactly. So I think we have great examples here, great examples in emerging markets for doing that.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about ready to shift over to audience questions. So, I'll open the floor now to everybody out there. Yeah. Okay. Just Mike.
Ben Finch. I'm a senior at Princeton. One question I have for the whole panel is, what do you think will be the role of finance in incentivizing energy transitions in developing countries? And I guess just in general, do you think this is something you expect to expand a lot or not?
I think finance is a lever. It's also reactive. And I think, the most important thing for developing countries is that their governments set the policy that can drive investment. So that's sort of first and foremost. It has to be country-led. And so that can happen through, in the global political process that's encapsulated in these nationally determined contributions that all countries globally that have signed on to the Paris Agreement have agreed to do. And so once you have that in place, then it becomes, okay, well then how do you actually finance that? And I think they're coming up with, these tools, these mechanisms in concert with regulatory reform, other enabling, and the jargon is enabling environment changes to actually make it possible to deploy these. Because I think, large-scale utility-scale solar in almost every country globally is highly cost competitive. Yeah. So it's not about the cost of the technology. It's about all the other things all of the other pieces of deployment that need to come together so that you can actually build and finance that.
I would say if I could respond real quick, I think there's a lever 4, and then there's one that might mitigate how much finance is needed. And public finance, I will start with, right? I think that's probably the question, because I think to Jesse's point, early on, if it's just investment and the private sector is investing, we've won the game, right? Like that's where we want to be. So I would say it's not the best to hear countries, the president of Barbados or the president of India say that it's a moral hazard for them to bear the brunt of the climate transition. And they require sort of funding to be provided to help them make that transition. So if that becomes a political sort of tip of the spear, I think you're going to see a lot of it. And many multilateral organizations are going to bear the brunt of that giant amount of financing that's required. I think, we just spoke about carbon. Sean just brought up carbon taxes or carbon, border adjustment mechanisms. The EU is passing this, right? The carbon border adjustment mechanism is I think, going to be law in 2026. What that is going to do is tax carbon throughout the value chain for inputs into the European Union. When it becomes cost prohibitive to kind of do work as you've done as a manufacturer, an industrialist, et cetera, then you're going to find sort of the bulk or the weight or the sort of who is doing the financing tip back towards the private sector.
Yeah, Chris Gregg. So you said that this decade is the critical decade. Everyone's saying it's the critical decade for action. You've all said that this is capital intensive, and it is. It's 3 or 4 times more capital intensive than business as usual. What sort of headwind do you think the rapidly rising interest rates are going to do cost of capital? I mean, this year in the US alone, it was less than 0.1% in January. It's 3.1% in September, and no end in September.
We're not done, yeah. No.
Have you seen any evidence that it's starting to slow people down?
We're early days, I would say, still. I mean, working at General Electric, I remembered sort of how much time it took, the latest production tax credit to sort of, matriculate through before we saw the next orders or before a sunset was happening. So I don't know kind of how quickly increasing interest rates are going to have an impact. But I would suggest there's probably, at least in the developing world, going to have not a great effect on having, doing capital intensive projects in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not probably, it's a major headwind, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree for those where debt financing is important. But for others, as long as the returns outweigh what they would, if they had the capital, what they would receive just from the invested cash, it probably not so much. Inflation's having a bigger impact on the whole cost on the economic evaluation at the moment. But for developing countries that have to borrow to fund, they're going to have a real problem. That'll be a headwind for sure.
Yeah, we've become accustomed to the idea that clean energy, renewable energy, particularly, gets cheaper every year. I think with the combination of inflation driving up input costs and higher interest rates driving up finance costs, I would be very surprised if we see cost declines across the sector in the next year or two. Hopefully we're back on that track. Afterwards, we've seen these cycles before. 2006, 2008 for solar and wind, we also saw costs go up for a few years before they resumed the overall trend. So this could be one of those cycles we're headed into right now.
I mean, you could see, I think I've heard, the argument I've heard is, in particular in the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act, that money is going to come online in a way that'll be counter-cyclical.
Yeah.
So if we do go into recession, that would actually kind of counteract some of these broader macroeconomic trends. So we'll
and particularly
see if that plays out.
For renewable energy projects, there'll be a large influx of financing there.
In developing countries, I've heard a couple, different opinions on this. One, because the cost of capital is already insanely high in developing countries, so it's 16-20%, whereas here it's 2-3% or it was. So it is already bad. So a lot of the what's a couple basis points when you're already in like a horrible place. So I think there are different opinions on this. Obviously, the trends aren't going in the right direction. foreign direct investment has been, I think the bigger issue is that foreign direct investment is leaving developing countries because you can get higher rates again in developed countries. So, we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I would just say that, yes, cost of borrowing exorbitantly high in developing countries, but that's why we might have like a loan guarantee to kind of buy down that cost, right? So, yeah, I mean, your point's well made.
We'll have to see. I mean, the bigger challenge and the more important thing will be getting the development finance institutions with more capital to spend, because they can extend loans in developing countries at these
Concessionary rates.
I mean, they're commercial rates for these institutions because they're self-sustaining, but they're using their AAA status and the backing of developed country governments to offer rates at 3%, 4%, 5%,
Right.
compared to a commercial bank in developing
And that's
country.
a huge drop then.
I mean, it's a huge. I mean, it goes from being uneconomic to economic.
Yep.
Hi, Brent Aldifer, renewable energy developer. I want to suggest something, get your comments on the pace at which this needs to happen, the scale of the capital, and how quickly it needs to come on. Combining a couple of ideas with what Jigger was talking about earlier. Let's take the U.S., for instance. We now have a policy with a tax credit and some other incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, who's going to move on it, right? And then you take that to a second concept. Well, there will be developers, as we did and others, that are going to propose projects to Jigger and other places, and capital's going to come in, and bankers are going to get comfortable with it. But I want to get your thoughts on, for financing to develop, let's take as it did for combined cycle natural gas plants, where you can now finance that without a PPA based on a wholesale energy market. It takes years. And why would private banking take a risk on building several hundred gigawatts of renewable energy in the US, for instance, and this could apply in other parts of the world, with the tremendous unknown impacts of what that does to wholesale energy prices? Is that going to depress prices? We're going to have price suppression. Who bears all that risk? And what I'd throw out is that you mentioned that the costs are there, the economics are now there. The finance, maybe capital's going up in cost with inflation, but the finance is there. The government policy is now there. I think the only way you could possibly get to that scale is the government in the U.S. and elsewhere is going to have to underwrite the finance and the loans to get to that kind of finance, even though the market's there, the economics are there, the projects are there, they're in the queue, in the interconnection queues. The only way you could possibly build the confidence to the credit, the risk, the credit that it's going to take that risk, it seems to me is going to have to be some kind of an underwriting. And the second thing, I'd like maybe a Fannie Mae mortgage underwriting, built a lot of houses. And the second thing I'd suggest before getting your comments is there really a lot of risk for the government to do that? Let's say it underwrites renewable energy prices for 20 years at $40 a megawatt hour, something for solar, or $60 for offshore wind. Let's say the government underwrites that at hundreds of gigawatts. What's the real risk? That energy prices go down? And if energy prices go down and the government is like out of money on their underwriting, there's so many other benefits in so many other places from energy prices going down, they could put tax back on to make it up, for that matter. So personally, having been in the business, I'd be interested in asking you as the finance experts, I don't see any other way you could possibly build with private financing that level of renewables as fast as we need to without a government underwriting program.
This is an approach that some countries have taken. I mean, the UK has contracts for differences that they are tendering at the government level for, 20-year offtake agreements. So we're saying we don't have to worry about getting your offtake lined up. We'll do it for you, and we'll guarantee your price, basically. I know there have been auction-based programs in India and Brazil and other places that have taken similar approaches. So how effective do you see that being in driving investment in those country contexts? That's something that the U.S. and elsewhere in Europe needs to be thinking more about.
I think that's been the model in Brazil for particularly their hydropower.
Yep, and wind, I believe, as well.
And they've had some challenges at times having successful auctions because of the price. But But at least once that auction happens, the development goes ahead. Like the barriers are limited. So I could see the model working. To the point made around what's the risk for the government, I see very low risk, right? And even energy prices going down in 20, 25 years. Like if you think about, we're electrifying the world essentially, and there's a long runway to get all transport electrified, all the infrastructure for that. There's a lot of demand coming there.
Yeah, I mean, just in the US alone, we're going to see electricity demand more than double by 2050, probably 120, 150% growth in electricity demand. I mean, that alone is, we have to double the size of our grid
Right.
while we're replacing it.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of demand, and prices are going to reflect that probably.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the replacement piece,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, I think you have to factor in retirements, aggressive retirements if we're going to follow sort of a coal retirement strategy, and then the massive deployments for transportation, things like that. So if you take that holistic picture, potentially there's a risk, but I don't know that you could see a future that's for sure going to have prices fall off a cliff.
I mean, in some ways we've done this with the Inflation Reduction Act, not fully, but partially by offering a substantial production tax credit or investment tax credit for over long-term periods, right? So not completely underwriting the cost, but we're basically saying, we'll roughly double your wholesale revenue with this tax credit. That's a, pretty good de-risking mechanism, but maybe not complete. I can't see the potential to combine these sort of tendering options with the sort of regional scale or programmatic scale efforts that we were talking about. Sort of as you, move forward and identify 10 gigawatts of projects that are, sort of social licenses there, the communities there, you're going to build out the supply chain for it. So it's delivering local jobs, it's delivering tax revenues. Then you go and do competitive auctions or tenders to see who wants to go and actually build those projects. And then the winning projects would get long-term price guarantees that that we're going to buy your power for the next 20 years at a set price, and then you can take that to the bank. There are options to sort of put these pieces together that might yield more rapid progress, and those are the kinds of models that I think would be interesting to explore. Other questions from the audience? In the back here. Oh, one here, and then I think Sam in the back. Yeah. Go ahead, Rob.
Rob Sokolow, Princeton. If you had a session in many time periods in the recent past that was about finance and technology for energy and climate, you'd be talking about end use at least some of the time. You talk about life cycle investments. You talk about the finance challenge of getting life cycle investment, and you'd be full of ideas about it. Where has that all gone? I mean, the buildings that are going to use the solar electricity, the appliances that are going to use them, the cars, and so forth. Where is that thinking? Can it be? Are we forgetting about it? Can it be, in fact, embedded in contracts that we talk about life cycle? Finance a community and talk about the buildings that are going to be built. Lots of these new cities all over the developing world where they start with a green field and there's 100,000 people living there, and they bought appliances in very large numbers. Where is this thinking? Where's it gone?
I would just say we could do it more systematically, but it hasn't gone away. In any of the programs that we've implemented, Deloitte, for USAID or World Bank, there are large components for energy efficiency, energy efficient buildings, energy efficient vehicles.
Examples? That would be very interesting.
Yeah, no, so I would take a look right now at SARUP, right? The South Asian Renewable Energy Program. Within it, there's a large component for energy efficiency, so being able to finance, I'm forgetting the name of kind of the India-funded hub that sort of serves as an energy efficiency bank that does things like funds new types of air conditioners, new types of industrial motors, and even things like demand response for grids to deploy, right? The demand response just in general meaning greater control of the grid to kind of ramp down demand during periods of high usage or peak usage. So it hasn't gone away. Many an argument could be made for it needs to be done, that more needs to be done. I would argue that it probably needs to be systematically done, where it isn't just a pocket of energy efficiency interventions and a pocket of renewable energy interventions.
That was my point, integrating it.
We've worked with a number of different entrepreneurs in our finance innovation lab who have models that are kind of speaking to this. So one was a domestic electric bus company, Proterra, who we worked with to develop battery service agreements. So, if you look at the cost of a diesel bus versus an electric bus is more expensive up front, but in most jurisdictions it's cheaper over the life cycle of the use, but you're concerned about the battery performance. Maybe you've never used it before. And so we worked with them to kind of separate out the price of selling the bus without the battery, and then a separate agreement for the battery itself. And so that essentially amortizes the cost of the battery over a 10-year period. We worked this year with a group called Real. They're out of the UK, but working in Southeast Asia and Africa. We worked with them to pull together a financial structure for affordable housing in Kenya, where they are similarly kind of building in energy efficiency into the housing units up front, and hoping to monetize those savings or pass on those savings actually to the people who buy those houses. And what they're doing is they're infilling land, so they're making sure that they're building these housing developments on unused land that's within urban boundaries, so you can also take advantage of being closer to services and public transport versus just building out and out and out in sprawl. So there's certainly a lot of models out there. Another one is about cooling, so using a servitization model to implement high efficiency cooling. Again, high upfront cost, lower operational expenditure. So it's instead of buying an air conditioner, you buy monthly units of cooling over a long-term period. So certainly seeing a lot of models that'll do this.
We haven't really touched on that. A lot of the supply side options are also distributed, right, in these contexts where maybe the state-run utility is just not able to function properly, and that you go around them by providing services directly to end customers. So even solar or other supply side options kind of become distributed. Anyone want to sort of touch on the financing models that have been maybe most successful or interesting in that space?
Yeah, I think one of the things is early stage investment in energy service companies. Mm-hmm. So that's part of what we proposed and USAID has done in the Caribbean, for instance, right? So in a place like Barbados or in other island nations that have large hotel industries, kind of enabling the private sector around it to be able to, pitch new technology, new, air conditioners, et cetera, for operating a hotel.
In developing countries, energy access through pay-as-you-go solar has been a hugely important model where and it's, we would call it a fintech solution now. You just use your phone to pay. And it's working. There's a few different companies that have been able to securitize those contracts to raise more money to grow their businesses. So it's been there's a lot of it's complicated, but there have been a few success stories there as well.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, Sam.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful panel. I'm Sam Chakrabarty. I'm working with Jess Jenkins here in Andlinger Center. So my question is related to, I want to understand what exactly is the difference in the nature and mechanism of financing projects related to generation expansion versus transmission expansion, especially with the enhanced drive for decarbonization and climate change mitigations, where you have new technologies coming up on the generation side. Not so sure about new technologies on the transmission side. And also if you could compare how things used to be in the past versus right now. Thanks.
So the generation side versus the network side. There are different models there. They tend to go together, or they tend to be financed separately.
I think at the moment they're a little bit bifurcated. The transmission, actually the transmission distribution market's huge and it's booming and it's critical to distributing energy. There's a few big players in that, and I think they own that because they own the infrastructure. So I think the one's more project financing and, you know, or ongoing operations, additional sort of expansion, or retrofitting, whatever it may be. So that's more capital financing. The transmission distribution is a long-term capital deployment with, you know, I think the revenue stream's more of like a rental return type of.
Over a 40-year period, maybe, a really long period too.
I could just say in some of the places that we've worked, I mean, it's tough to try to crowd in private financing for transmission and distribution infrastructure because it's hard to capture the revenue. So a lot of what we do with utilities, state-owned utilities in different countries, is to suggest, recommend that they spin off their generation function, or once spun off, encourage private participation in generation. Then you get a giant cost item off of the books for them. And that way they can spend on what their core function is, which is the wires, right? So I would actually mention a couple of different things here. So, you know, the issue in many of the countries in which I work is that the tariffs are so low that there isn't the revenue stream there to invest in grid expansion. So that's why we're doing a lot of this work, but it involves getting their financial house in order. But what, you know, there could be a model for that we don't see a lot of right now is sort of portfolio kind of guarantees for, you know, equipment pull through, right? New types of inverters, new types of substations, things like that. That can be done, but it takes kind of a large risk appetite, slow burn sort of revenue, not high return, but just being there to, you know, backstop folks that will, a utility that will continually invest in their metering and all of these, you know, kind of add-on infrastructure.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the great conversation.
Thank you.